The use, near the end of that section, notice the use of very value-laden terms like plundered, ravaged, burnt, and destroyed. I've highlighted those as well. This is meant to evoke strong emotions in the reader. The ambiguity in this section is interesting as well. Notice that even though we're alleging 28 separate crimes, nowhere does it say on Tuesday the 14th at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, the king did this. All right, there's too much detail to that. Jefferson leaves it very broad, which means it's hard to defend. The king can't say, I'm not guilty of doing that on that particular day at that particular time. So Jefferson leaves things very ambiguous by choice. The fourth section of the Declaration is called the Denunciation to the British People. And this is another section that Jefferson and John Adams fought about. This portion of the Declaration was a big area of contention between those two. Jefferson, who really wanted to condemn the British citizens, and those like John Adams who recognized that was probably not politically smart. There was some portion, even in Parliament, that was sympathetic to the American cause. There's one particular member of Parliament, he's an Irishman, not a Brit, named Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke spoke on behalf of the Americans a number of times, spoke against the king and his treatment of the American colonies a number of times. Well, Jefferson wanted to condemn him like every other British citizen. John Adams said, that's not politically smart. And the two of them debated and argued that point. Adams, again, won the day. Jefferson's original denunciation was much more strongly worded. And we know that because we have a number of the drafts. This section finishes the case for independence by restating that the Americans and the British are two distinct peoples. Lastly, the conclusion, the fifth section. Unlike the rest of the document, this section is very formulaic, but for the final sentence. There's a sense of building drama through the entire Declaration, which comes to a head in this particularly solemn vow, again, the last sentence. The signers pledged not only to each other, but to all of posterity, to us, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. This final pledge is meant to appeal to the cult of honor that was popular amongst educated persons in the 18th century. I would point out finally that while the Declaration begins at a very impersonal tone, even philosophical tone, it ends in very personal terms. The persistent use of personal pronouns in the concluding paragraphs brings the action to a very personal level. So your homework for tonight is to take the Declaration home and read it aloud and see if you can hear that cadence. Let's shift gears here a little bit, and what I want to talk about is the lead up to the writing of the Constitution. So I want to talk about the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation are finally ratified in 1781. They're in place a couple of years before that, so it's hard to pin down exactly how many years this government existed. But let's use 1781. From 1781 through 1787, the new nation operated under a government that was laid out in what was called the Articles of Confederation. Supporters, there aren't many, but there are some, supporters of this short-lived experiment point to three distinct accomplishments of the Confederation government. We're going to talk about the weaknesses here in just a moment, but let's talk about what this government did well. The first thing they did well is they won the war with the British. It's under the Confederation government that these 13 colonies come together and defeat the strongest army and the strongest navy in the world. That's quite an accomplishment. Their second accomplishment is this is the government that signs the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending the war. So they won the war and they won the peace. Their third accomplishment was creating and passing the Northwest Ordinance, that other founding document that lays out this part of the country. So for a failed system of government, they had three fairly large accomplishments. Unfortunately, this government had more weaknesses than it had strengths, and I want to focus on those for a couple minutes. The most distinctive feature of the Confederation government was its weak executive, and you think about that for a moment, it makes sense. This branch of government was made intentionally weak because of the founders' experience with George III. Somebody they had called a tyrant and a despot. And the last thing they wanted to do was create a new tyrant and despot. So they made the executive intentionally weak. And when I'm talking to high schoolers, I illustrate that point by saying, can you name any of the 14 presidents under the Confederation? And the answer is invariably no. I suspect probably nobody in this room can name any of those 14 presidents. We're used to thinking about George Washington as the first president of the United States. He's actually the 15th. There were 14 under the Confederation. George Washington is the first president under the U.S. Constitution. We forget those 14 because they are weak. They don't have the ability to do much. A second weakness of the Confederation government was that this government had a very limited power to tax. That may sound good to us, but it was a problem. The government could only ask the states for money. They had to ask nicely, but they could only ask for money. They had no mechanism by which to force the states to pay. So this was a government that was constantly out of money. They would ask New York, can you contribute a little bit? New York would say, well, things are kind of tough. Why don't you try New Hampshire? Well, things are tough here too. So the fact that they can't requisition money, they have to simply ask for it, means that they're always out of money. A third weakness of the Confederation government was it had a limited power to conduct diplomacy on behalf of all the states. What that means, as a result, you had a very chaotic situation in which individual states were crafting treaties with other nations. So New Hampshire might sign a treaty with France, and New York might sign a treaty with England, and another state might sign a third treaty. You can imagine that was very chaotic and that didn't work well. But the most important weakness was the fact that any of the 13 states could veto legislation, and that legislation was then dead. So imagine a situation where 12 of the 13 states agree on something, and little Rhode Island, from nowhere, says veto, and that legislation is dead. So it was almost impossible to get legislation passed in this system. As a result, we're in a very precarious situation. We've beaten the strongest nation in the world. We're laying the foundations for our future, and so far, we're laying those foundations on sand. Suffice it to say that this was a government that had no teeth at the federal level. As a result, by the middle of the 1780s, the country was in serious crisis. To address the crisis and to revise the Articles of Confederation, representatives from several states met in Annapolis in the summer of 1786. It's called the Annapolis Convention. Their limited goal was to try to come up with a national plan on regulating trade. They weren't going to create a new government. They were trying to do one thing: regulate trade. Even in this limited area, they were unable to come to an agreement. At the close of the convention, the delegates discussed the possibility of calling another convention the following summer. It was actually Alexander Hamilton that did this. We have accounts of Hamilton literally grabbing men by their jackets, by the tail of their jackets, and begging them, will you please come back to Philadelphia next summer? We've got to fix this. Still, there was little expectation that a Philadelphia convention would fare any better. That changed when the need for a convention was given greater urgency by the outbreak of a rebellion in western Massachusetts. Looking for tax relief, monetary reform, and military-backed pay owed by the state government, the citizens of western Massachusetts rebelled. They rebelled under a farmer and Revolutionary War veteran by the name of Daniel Shays. The Shays Rebellion was eventually put down by the Massachusetts militia. The Massachusetts militia, not the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army was actually smaller than the Massachusetts militia, so they weren't up to the task. The militia had to come down and put down this rebellion, but not before causing many around the country to believe that the federal government had to be strengthened so it could deal with these kind of threats. Without this rebellion as sort of the proximate cause of real anxiety around the nation, the Constitutional Convention would almost surely never have happened in 1787. So let's look at that convention. When the delegates convened in 1787, the original states, with the exception of Rhode Island, they're always a problem, sent representatives. In fact, earlier that year, the states had collectively appointed 70 individuals to the convention in Philadelphia. A number of those who were selected, however, could not accept, or they simply couldn't afford to go. It's important to note at this point in our nation's history, we're at 1787, that even among the founders, there had become two very divided groups that held differing opinions on the need for this constitutional convention. The historian Larry Schweikert calls these two groups the two streams of liberty. And those of you that know the history understand we're, of course, talking about the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists had leaders like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry. They were sympathetic to what they called the spirit of '76. They believed that the Articles of Confederation, that floundering government, they believed the Articles laid out a good system. It just needed a few tweaks. They liked that it protected the sovereignty of the states against centralized power. Their greatest fear, the Anti-Federalist greatest fear, was consolidation of power in a centralized authority. And they were very, very suspicious of the motives of those who called for the Constitutional Convention. Now, the other group were the Federalists, or they were also known as the Nationalists. And this included men like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison. This group believed that the national government had to be strengthened or it would simply continue to flounder. This new nation would split up into many nations. The Federalists pointed to the Confederation's inability to supply the Continental Army during the war. So they pointed back at things like Valley Forge. And they said our men didn't have housing, they didn't have food, they didn't have medical care because the government was weak. The government was chaotic. We need a stronger government. These leaders, the Federalists, and Madison especially, believed that power had to be ceded by the states to a central government for the nation to reach its full potential. They looked to broaden the power of the federal government to do two things: to tax and to regulate commerce. This group saw what they believed to be the huge economic potential of the new nation. In the end, that Constitutional Convention, very few of the anti-federalist leaders chose to attend. Neither Sam Adams nor Patrick Henry went. In fact, Patrick Henry was asked by a newspaper reporter, "Why aren't you going to Philadelphia?" And he said, quote, "He smelt a rat," S-M-E-L-T, a rat. In choosing not to attend, however, the anti-federalists largely ceded the convention to the Federalist point of view. Of those who did attend, they ranged in age on the young end from Jonathan Dayton, who was just 26, to Benjamin Franklin, who was 81. Benjamin Franklin had been the oldest member 11 years earlier in writing the Declaration of Independence. He's now the oldest member in this group that's writing the Constitution, and his health is not good. At this time, Benjamin Franklin suffers from kidney stones, gallstones, gout, and a number of other maladies. He had to be carried to the sessions in Independence Hall on a sedan chair. If you don't know what a sedan chair is, picture a lazy boy on two poles. And what they would do each morning, they would take 4 prisoners from the Philadelphia jail. They would go to Benjamin Franklin's house. They would put him in that chair, and the prisoners would hoist him up onto their shoulders, and they would carry him through the streets. And the people would gather. It was like a parade every day, watching Mr. Franklin go to Independence Hall. And Franklin ate it up. He was a ham, right? He would wave to the ladies with his handkerchief, and he would kiss babies and things. He was quite the showman. Now, the average age of those who met that summer in Philadelphia was quite young. The average age was just 42. There are 55 delegates who participate that summer. I don't want to give the illusion that there's always 55 members there, because almost always there are fewer than that. Usually 40-some, sometimes only 30-some are there at the same time. But keep the number 55 in mind. 39 of those who participated that summer had experience serving in a previous Congress. So they had legislative experience. That was going to be very important to them. 8 of the 55 who participated had worked on writing new state constitutions. At the end of the war, the states rewrote their constitutions. So 8 of these individuals had been involved in that process. That's going to be very important as well. 7 of the 55 had been state governors, so they had executive experience. 34 of the 55, some of you may snicker at this, 34 of them were lawyers. So they had the experience with the law, judicial experience. 1/3 of those that participated that summer were veterans of the Continental Army. Nearly all of those who attended were gentlemen, or what Thomas Jefferson called natural aristocrats. These were men who took their political superiority. It wasn't bad to talk in those terms in the 18th century. They took their political superiority for granted as the inevitable consequence of their social and economic position. These were the leaders of their communities. While some who attended were still wealthy, many of those who attended had lost their wealth during the war or the ensuing bad economy. In fact, some of them had to borrow money just to attend the convention. In 1776, the 56 men that came to Philadelphia rented the nicest houses. They were wealthy. 11 years later, it's a very different situation. They're staying in taverns, some are staying in barns, some are renting houses together. So it's a very different experience in 1787. Lastly, and probably most importantly, 12 of the 55 who participated either owned slaves or managed slave-operated plantations. The group that ultimately gathered in Philadelphia, again, is composed of 55 men. And they met in the exact same room where 11 years earlier, the Second Continental Congress had authorized and signed the Declaration of Independence. As they began their proceedings, the delegates at this convention understood they had one distinct advantage over the group that met 11 years earlier. And that advantage was that independence was already a fact. They didn't have to try to explain why the break with Great Britain was necessary. As a result, they could focus on the task at hand. But what was that task? Were they in Philadelphia simply to fine-tune the existing government, the Articles of Confederation, or were they there to create something entirely new? If it was the latter, this went way beyond the charge that most of them had been given by the people of their states when they were sent to Philadelphia. The issue of whether or not they were there to tinker with the Articles or begin anew was decided shortly after the convention commenced. They were there to create something new. Once this monumental decision was made, the question is, where do they go from there? You can imagine the air had to come out of the room. When the vote was taken to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, that group existed in what they called at the time a state of nature. There are no rules, right? We're living in the wilderness. What do we do now? Into that vacuum stepped James Madison, and he brought with him a plan for government that became known as the Virginia Resolves. The resolves give the delegates a framework for moving forward. Madison had prepared the Virginia Resolves after arriving 10 days earlier than any of the other delegates so he could prepare. What Madison did, Madison's best friend was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was living in France at this time. He was our envoy to the French. James Madison wrote to his best friend and said, buy every book you can on the history of Republican government. I got to do some cramming before this convention. So Madison gets there 10 days early, spends 16 to 18 hours a day reading the history of Republican government. What were their strengths? What were their weaknesses? Where did they succeed? Where did they fail? So again, when the vote is taken to get rid of the existing government, Madison's ready. And that's why we call Madison the father of the Constitution. Several times during the convention, this very diminutive man, he's only 5 feet tall and has a whispery voice because he'd been very sick as a child. James Madison steps into that void and saves the convention. As the delegates set their course, they realized that there was one general issue and two specific issues that they were going to have to deal with. The general issue, or the general question, was how strong do we make this new federal government? Many of the delegates, the Federalists especially, believed a strong national government was essential to bring together 13 disparate states. They didn't have a whole lot in common other than the fact that they had fought the British at this point. However, their recent experience with despotism told them that a strong centralized government could be the ruin of the new republic. So it's a fine line that they're trying to walk. That's the general issue. The two specific issues were representation and slavery. Let's talk first about representation. The disagreement on representation, of course, came between the large states and the small states. Large and growing states like Virginia wanted increased power in this new national government. Small states feared that they would have little power under any new system. Debate centered on two plans for representation. There's actually a third plan that's offered, and I'll mention it, but it doesn't get any serious backing. The two plans that got most of the discussion were the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan was again authored by James Madison, but because of his diminutive status, because of the fact that Madison understood he didn't make a very good impression when he spoke, he wrote it, but he handed it off to the 34-year-old governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, and Edmund Randolph presented it. Edmund Randolph was the Cary Grant of his day, right? He was the Rock Hudson of colonial America. He was tall and he was dark and he was good looking and he had a deep voice and he spoke well. If they allowed ladies into the room, they would have been especially impressed with Edmund Randolph. Madison writes the plan, Randolph offers it. And basically the plan says this: representation will be determined by population. At that moment, the representatives from the small states leapt to their feet. They began to jeer Edmund Randolph. They said, you're no better than George III. You're a despot. You're a tyrant, right? All the bad things that we said about George III. You want to make us second-class citizens. George Washington, who was president of the convention, had to gavel things to a close. So they cooled off for a while and came back. And when they came back, there was a second plan offered. That was the New Jersey plan. That was offered by the delegate, William Patterson. William Patterson said representation should be equal among the states. It was equal under the Articles of Confederation. Every state got one vote. He said we shouldn't change that. Every state should be equal under the new system. Now, I said there was a third plan. That was offered by Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the hero of the Battle of Yorktown. Alexander Hamilton had been orphaned as a young teen By the age of 15, he was running his deceased father's shipping business down in the West Indies, multi-million-dollar business. Alexander Hamilton was a brilliant, brilliant young man. He was discovered by a trader that was coming through the West Indies, recognized his talent. He said, young man, you're going to sell this shipping company and I'm going to get you educated. So he took him to New York, put him through King's College, which is now Columbia, and Alexander Hamilton got an education. The war broke out before he could finish that education. So Alexander Hamilton, as an older teen, served on the personal staff for George Washington. He spent most of the war writing correspondence for Washington, constantly begging Washington, put me in the game, coach, let me fight, I want to fight for my country. He got his opportunity at Yorktown, and it's Alexander Hamilton that leads the final charge. It's as if Hollywood wrote it. He's the first one over the battlement, and they win. So he's a genuine war hero. Because he's a war hero, when he jumps to his feet and says, I have a plan, they show him deference. They let him speak. And he speaks for the next 6 hours. And what he says basically is, gentlemen, we don't need to come up with a new plan. We already have an example of the best government ever created by man. That is the British system. You can imagine how that went over in that room. He literally could not get a second for his plan, right? He was the plan's only supporter. Hamilton said what he valued most was stability. So his plan included things like this. Senators would serve for life, right? In a day today when we're talking about term limits, he wanted senators to serve for natural life. He believed the executive should also serve for life. And when he said that, again, people jumped up and they said, you're trying to create a monarchy. And he said, well, it's not a monarchy, right? We're going to elect that person, and when they die, we'll elect someone new. It's very democratic. Well, they didn't buy that either. Hamilton said the federal government should be able to override state laws. It was a plan without supporters. So at the end of those 6 hours, Alexander Hamilton sat down. He received no support. He went home for about a month and a half, right, before he summoned the courage to go back and spend more time at the convention. Before a compromise was reached between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, the delegates actually considered erasing the borders of the existing states and reapportioning them so that they would be more equal in size. 81-year-old Ben Franklin had it one day, and he began to just erase things on the map. And he said, we'll give this portion of Pennsylvania to Delaware just to shut them up. Obviously, they didn't do that in the end, but things got quite heated during that discussion. But a compromise is reached, and it's known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And this is a compromise offered by delegate from Connecticut, Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman is one of my favorite people in the founding generation because he's forgotten. Roger Sherman is the only one present when all 4 of the founding documents are created. Roger Sherman was a devout Christian from Connecticut. In fact, he made a practice of reading the Bible through every year. He would take copious notes in the margins, probably like Rodney does. He would underline things. He would highlight things. And at the end of the year, he would sign that Bible and give it to one of his 15 children. But Roger Sherman had a quirk. When Roger Sherman would speak, he had a habit of bobbing. And I don't know if you've got your phone with you, you could look up a picture of Roger Sherman. He's described as very bird-like in appearance and manner. So the other members of the delegation referred to him as the bobbing bird when he would speak. And Roger Sherman said, gentlemen, we don't have to choose one plan or the other, right? We're not at an impasse. There's a compromise to be reached. We can use both plans. We'll create an upper house and a lower house. In the upper house, we'll call that the Senate. All the states will be equal. They'll each get 2 votes. in the lower house, representation will be determined by population. George Washington said, "Whew, thank goodness for Roger Sherman." And the compromise on that issue was reached. The second specific issue they had to deal with was slavery, and this one's a little tougher. The question was, how do we gain enough support from the 12 Southern delegates for an eventual document? How do we get enough of them to sign where this thing looks legitimate at the end? We don't want slavery, but we got to get enough of these guys to sign so that it's legitimate. They go about it this way. First, the founders sought to establish a sort of expiration date for slavery protections. In order to placate the fears of Southern representatives, the Northern delegates agreed to a deal in which the issue of slavery would not be addressed by the federal government for 20 years. And if you're one of those folks that carries around a pocket constitution, you can find this in your constitution. January 1st, 1808 is the date you're going to find in your constitution. No pronouncements on slavery until that date. Theoretically, this is the thinking at the time, this would give the South time to reorder their economy to exist without slavery. Now, we look back in retrospect and say, wow, that's naive. But that's what they believed at the time. And it would also give slave owners time to prepare their slaves for freedom. George Washington is one of the ones that took this seriously. George Washington freed his slaves in his will, but he said they're not free to go until they have a trade and they can read. Right? That sounds cruel to us. We want manumission immediately. But Washington said nothing could be crueler than to send those folks out into the world without a trade and without the ability to read. Modern apologists for the founders have seen this as what they call the gradualist approach to abolition. You see, at this time, if statistics were done, and they did statistics, but not the way we do today, there was a belief that slavery was dying a natural death. There were fewer and fewer slaves coming into the country every year. If you plotted those new slaves coming in on a chart, right, it would have a downward trend to it. So at the time of the Constitutional Convention, they said, yes, slavery's an issue, but it's going away. All we've got to do is make sure that it continues to go away, and then we'll be done with it. That's the gradualist approach. But slavery didn't die a natural death. In fact, it was reborn when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. You may say, why would that invention create a need for more slaves? Well, you have to understand how cotton was processed. In the days before the cotton gin, slaves would go into the field. They would put the cotton in a wagon. The wagon would be brought back to the barn. They would pile all the cotton in the center of the barn. The slaves would sit around the cotton and pick out the shells, right? This is where we get the term cotton pickers. They would pick out the shells, save the good cotton. That was an incredibly labor-intensive job. It took many, many slaves to pick the cotton. Eli Whitney's gin does it almost instantaneously, so what do we need? More slaves out in the field. So the cotton gin creates a new economy. And that line that had been going down naturally now skyrockets, and many, many more slaves start coming into the country. So their second attempt to deal with this issue is what we call the 3/5 compromise. This was the solution to the question of how slaves should be counted for the purpose of representation in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. And there were two basic proposals that were put forward. Follow closely. The first proposal is this. Non-slave states put forward a proposal to only count free persons for determining representation. I'll say that again. Non-slave states, right? So Ohio would be not at that time, but I'm using it as an example. Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, right? Northern states. Non-slave states put forward a proposal to only count free persons. Why? They don't want to give the southern states any advantage in terms of representation just because they get to count their what? Unfree persons, their slaves. Slave state representatives countered with another proposal. They said, no, we have to fully count slaves. We want as many representatives as we can get. This method would, of course, guarantee these states more representatives in the House. The result was a compromise in which 3/5 of the slave population would be counted for the purpose of determining representation. Now, it's important who offered this, right? As we look back into history and we like to assign blame to groups of people, let's remember this. The compromise was offered by James Wilson of Pennsylvania. So the 3/5 compromise, which has been caricatured as racist by a lot of modern historians, that compromise wasn't offered by a Southern racist. It was offered by James Wilson of the North, who was vehemently anti-slavery. The free states saw this compromise, the 3/5 compromise, as a victory. And they saw it as a victory for two reasons. First, it severely limited Southern power by limiting the number of Southern delegates. Second, it moved the nation a step closer to abolition. Remember, we just talked about gradualism. They wanted to get rid of slavery over time. This is in keeping with that, right? So it's a gradualist approach to abolition. Rather than celebrating this incremental process, some modern critics have suggested the agreement, the 3/5 compromise, was merely the product of the racist attitudes of the majority of the founders who saw blacks as less than fully human. I'm not going to be an apologist for the founders. There were racists in the room. John Rutledge is a good example, right? But to characterize all of the founders as believing that blacks were less than fully human is simply incorrect, right? It's simply incorrect. Fortunately, this misinterpretation is easily disproven. Keep in mind, it was the slave states that wanted to what? Fully count slaves. While it was the delegates from the free states that said, no, don't count them at all. Second, the fact that free blacks, regardless of where they lived, north or south, were counted the same as free whites. This would seem to discredit the charge of widespread racism. If race really were an issue, there would have been a movement to discount free blacks as well, and there wasn't. Finally, keep in mind who it was that offered the compromise. Again, it was James Wilson, an abolitionist from the North. Let me conclude with this. Conclude this section. No doubt the issues confronted by the founders were difficult. Many times during the convention, the delegates thought about giving up. At no time during the summer of 1787 do George Washington's letters convey much hope. George Mason, who had been a part of the Second Continental Congress 11 years earlier, wrote of the Constitutional Convention, quote, "I would not again serve in that convention for 1,000 pounds per day." The revolt from Great Britain and the formations of our new government at that time were nothing compared to the great business now before us. Many delegates worried that they might be seen as going too far by creating an entirely new government. Remember, they hadn't been sent there to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. They were sent to fix it. They had been sent to Philadelphia in order to tweak the Articles. Illustrating this concern, at one point, William Patterson of New Jersey worried aloud, "We shall be charged by our constituents with usurpation." Still, the delegates understood the Constitution they were creating would have a great effect on future generations of Americans and around the world. James Wilson, who offered the Three-Fifths Compromise, said this. He said, "We're providing a constitution for future generations, not merely for the circumstances of the moment." John Rutledge of South Carolina said, "We're laying the foundation for a great empire." And James Madison said, "This plan will decide forever the fate of Republican government." But there were those that were also concerned about failure. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts said at one point, "Something must be done, or we shall disappoint not only America, but the whole world." One thing was abundantly clear. The convention in Philadelphia marked a distinct shift in political leadership in the United States. Some of the major revolutionary leaders who we met last week were unable to be part of the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, we said, wasn't there. He was in France serving as our American ambassador. John Adams, who was so important in creating the Declaration, wasn't there during the Constitutional Convention. He was in England as our ambassador. His cousin and anti-federalist, Sam Adams, again, refused to participate because he thought the convention betrayed the spirit of '76. James Madison emerged as the most important new leader. Madison was too young 11 years earlier. He was only 26 when the Declaration was written. There were older men, wiser men that took his place. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, he was 37, and he earned the moniker again, Father of the Constitution. While we look back today at what this remarkable generation of American leaders achieved, we cannot lose sight of the fact that there was anything but unanimity that summer. And I demonstrate that with this fact. Of the 55 delegates who participated that summer, 16 of them refused to sign the final product. Only 39 of the 55 signed the Declaration or signed the Constitution. Some of them actively campaigned against its ratification. Patrick Henry, who refused to be part of the convention, once the convention was over, he traveled to every single state ratifying convention and spoke against the Constitution. But to his credit, and how different is this than what we see today, to his credit, once he lost that argument and the Constitution was ratified, he pledged his allegiance to the new government. Despite the difficulties they had to overcome, the form of government these men created has now endured for over 240 years, with just over 24 amendments. What I want to conclude with tonight, in just a few more minutes, are the first 10 of those amendments, and that's known as the Bill of Rights. So let's finish with this. The first 10 amendments, known collectively as the Bill of Rights, were added to the Constitution almost immediately after ratification. Since that time, historians pointed to a long and continuous development of these rights from specific English roots. So let's take a look at those roots. Let's look back into history and see where these rights came from. The first document that we find in history is the Magna Carta, signed by the English nobility in the year 1215. Despite the presence of unknown words like scuddage and wapenstakes, which locate the Grand Charter squarely in the feudal era, the spirit of the document speaks to subsequent generations. It speaks to us. In other words, the Magna Carta is more than a practical document specifically designed to solve feudal difficulties, 13th century difficulties. True, King John was forced to recognize the existence of traditional rights amongst the nobles, but there are a set of principles which inform the 63 chapters of the document signed at Runnymede in 1215 and reaffirmed by subsequent British monarchs. The principles extended beyond the often recognized origin of the no taxation without representation doctrine in chapter 12 and the due process clause in chapter 39, who thought that those important parts of the U.S. Constitution came from the Magna Carta. The concepts of trial by jury and no cruel and unusual punishments also appear in Chapter 21. But the most important contribution to the Magna Carta is the claim that there is a fundamental set of principles that even the king must respect. Above all else, Magna Carta makes the case that the people have a right to expect reasonable conduct by their monarch. The second document that informs our Bill of Rights is what's known as the English Petition of Right. And this is from 1628. The Petition of Right is the second of the three great British documents that provided a strong common law component to the development of the American Bill of Rights. The authors of the statute consciously invoke the memory of the rule of law from Magna Carta. They insist that the monarchy honor and respect the rights to which Englishmen have become accustomed. In the 13th century, the nobles petitioned the king to abandon his arbitrary and tyrannical policies. 4 centuries later, in the 17th century, it was the commoners who petitioned the king to adhere to the principles of reasonable government bequeathed as part of the English tradition. Under the leadership of Sir Edward Coke, a legal scholar turned politician, Parliament petitioned Charles I to uphold the traditional rights of Englishmen. Among the customary diverse rights and liberties of the subjects, these will sound familiar, were no taxation without consent, due process of law, habeas corpus, no quartering of troops, respect for private property, and again, no cruel and unusual punishment. All of those are found in the English Petition of Right. To be sure, King Charles did not consider himself bound by the petition. In fact, he simply disregarded it. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to underestimate the importance of this document, the importance for America. On the one hand, it reaffirmed the right to petition as a fundamental right that can be invoked legitimately against a monarch who has strayed from his traditional principles. Moreover, Coke's argument still had considerable appeal over 100 years later on the other side of the Atlantic. We're talking about us. During the 1760s, the American colonists articulated their grievances against King George in terms reminiscent of Coke's petition to uphold the rights of Englishmen. The third document that informs our Bill of Rights is known as the English Bill of Rights, and this is from 1689. The third British contribution to the development of the American Bill of Rights, again, is the English Bill of Rights. Unhappy with the absolutist tendencies of King James II, Parliament declared an end to his 3-year reign. Said, "You're done," listing several indictments against him. Parliament then issued a declaration of the rights and liberties of the subject. Never again declared the agreement between Parliament and the newly enthroned monarchs, this is William and Mary, never again must the religion, laws, and liberties of the realm be put in danger by the king. To that end, several ancient rights of Englishmen were reaffirmed. The right to petition government, the expectation that government policy shall follow and confirm the rule of law, that standing armies in peacetime are against the law, they're illegal, that excessive bail ought not be required or excessive fines imposed, right? All of this should sound familiar. That cruel and unusual punishments should not be inflicted. However, in the Declaration of Rights that Englishmen have are the right to the free exercise of religion and the right to choose their form of government. In conclusion, in many ways, the 10 amendments that make up the Bill of Rights have come to be just as important as the foundational document they amplify. The Bill of Rights outlines those basic privileges we think of as the birthright for each and every American. We can never forget the ideas contained in those 10 amendments that have a much longer lineage than simply 1787. And that lineage ties our country inexorably with our British ancestors. Thank you. Now, what I left out in the interest of time, and I do want to leave some couple of minutes for questions. Once the Constitutional Convention was over, there was a big argument that was had all over the country that's still going on today. And it's the argument about what's known as compact theory. Is the government that was created a compact? Thomas Jefferson said it was, right? He said the 13 states joined the Union freely. In doing so, they created a compact. And what you join freely, guess what? You can unjoin. The other side of that argument is known as the federal theory of government. Abraham Lincoln was big on the federal theory. Abraham Lincoln said once the 13 colonies joined a federal government, they gave up their sovereignty, and they're part of the whole, right? It's a melting pot. And once you've joined, you can't unjoin. That's what the whole Civil War is about. South Carolina follows Thomas Jefferson. They said it's a compact. We joined it. We can unjoin it. It's like a country club, right? Abraham Lincoln said no. You've given up that right, and we're going to fight you to prove it, that you're still part of the nation. So there's a lot of reading you can do on what's called the compact theory and the federal theory. Again, that argument takes place especially right after the Constitutional Convention, but it continues today. We have states that continually cite the compact theory of government. California, before marijuana was legalized across the nation, Californians smoked marijuana because California said, this is a compact, we're going to do whatever we want, and if you don't like it, we'll unjoin. Right? And other states said, well, you can't do that. Right? All right, with that said, I felt guilty for skipping that, but with that said, are there questions about tonight that I can answer for anybody? Al, go ahead. They're leaders of their community, right? One of the things that most of the people that settled here in the British colonies and then the American colonies, one of the things we believe very strongly was that your value doesn't come from how you're born. Your value comes, right, from being a creation of God, but also how you live your life. So it was very, very important in the American communities how you lived your life. Did you work from sun up to sundown? Did you attend church? Did you take care of your neighbor? When you were fortunate, what did you do with your money? Did you use it to take care of others? Right? People paid attention to how you lived your life. That was Jefferson's description of the natural aristocracy. In the United States, you're not born into an aristocracy, you rise to it naturally. So how you live your life determines whether or not you're one of those leaders that ends up being part of the signers. Yeah, good question. What else? Rodney. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like they knew they had this moment, and this moment was going to transcend them.
Yeah. John Hancock paid for 500 copies of the Declaration to be made immediately, and those were sent all over the country. But he also paid for it to be translated into several foreign languages. It was translated into French, into German, and literally sent all over the world. Because, as Rodney's saying, they saw their cause as universal. Now, where we've kind of gone wrong in recent history, George Bush believed that democracy was universal, and that if you just showed people how democracy worked, they'd fall in love with it. Well, he confused one with the other, right? It wasn't democracy that the founders were pitching to the rest of the world. It was this notion that we have certain inalienable rights given vertically by God to us, and we create government to protect those rights. George Bush missed that day, right? And he said, well, democracy's the same as those inalienable rights. We'll just share that with the world, and they're going to love it. Yeah. We tried it in Iraq, and it didn't work. Yeah. What else? Go ahead, Al. Shoot again. Yep. For the British? Really, World War II. The British are going to come back and give Napoleon a great fight 20 years down or 30 years down the road. The British have a lot of fight left in them. The British are still leaders in the world into World War I. They're terribly battered in World War I. But it's really World War II that ends Great Britain as a world power. And now they're not much. Yeah. I think their economy is about the size of Mississippi, somebody told me the other day. So the British have fallen precipitously. Yeah. So next time, I know I've told you already, but I want to whet your appetite again if I can lay my hands on it. Next time we're going to talk about nullification. Nullification as a synonym, it's interposition. That's the idea that the states are the ultimate safeguard against out-of-control federal government. And there's going to be a discussion about this too, right? The United States is going to choose sides on nullification. But we're going to start with that. And then we're going to talk about the Northwest Ordinance, the document that creates this area, right? We know the story of Marietta. The founders start in Ipswich, Massachusetts. They get in canoes. They come down the rivers. They settle in this area. Eventually, we get the Northwest Ordinance, which divides this area into 5 states, plus a small sliver of Minnesota. And there are 2 great things that the Northwest Ordinance does. It provides for public education and what? No slavery. Right? And many historians have said from the moment the Northwest Ordinance was passed, the Civil War was inevitable. Once you have a portion of the country that has outlawed slavery, the South is going to fight to try to regain that right. So we'll talk about the Northwest Ordinance. And then lastly, we're going to finish with the Federalist era, which again is the 2 Washington presidencies and the John Adams presidency. We'll have a lot more fun with Washington than we do with Adams. Adams is kind of a sad character by the time he gets to the White House. What's fun about the Washington presidency is many of the things that we associate with the presidency today, like the State of the Union address, George Washington had to make those up. Right? We play Hail to the Chief when the president walks into the room. They asked Washington, do you think there ought to be a song when you walk into the room? You know, what should it be? Should it be Yankee Doodle? Right? There are actually people that proposed that. So many of those traditions are born under George Washington, and we still celebrate them today. So we'll do that next time, and then our last time together, we're going to talk about Jefferson's 2 terms, and again, the evolutionary, revolutionary American language. So thank you very much. If you have questions about anything, come see me. Say goodbye to Brandon on your way out. He drove a long ways to be here. Thank you, everybody, very much for coming. I appreciate it.